Content warning. This story contains depictions of physical violence and the death of a child. Scenes of brutality are described with restraint and no gratuitous detail. Viewer discretion is advised. On a plantation so vast that sound seemed to fall into the sugarcane and vanish, a woman learned to make herself small. The place was a world in miniature, a main house flanked by servant quarters, a yard that smelled of sweat and lime, fields that rolled toward the horizon in oppressive neatness. Under that unrelenting sun, every life was measured by labor, and every body had a price. This is the real story of a slave's silent struggle for revenge in Brazil. Not the kind of legend that wipes its hands clean with heroics, nor the tidy parable that settles into moral certainty. It is a slow, cold movement of grief turned into calculation, of someone invisible by design learning to read the map of the powerful and to trace quietly the possibility of reprisal. The plantation had a name the owners gave it, a graceful Portuguese word meant to conjure benevolence. The workers called it by the shape it took in their mouths, as a place that consumed names and returned only hours. At dawn you could hear the chorus of the field, low calls, the metallic bite of tools in the soil, the chant that kept bodies in sync with sun and season. At night the house glowed like an island, its windows leaking laughter and music and the rustle of the señor's guests. Between field and house moved the sleepers, meal carries, the children left with the old women, the people whose hands had been claimed by paper and ink, and a market that measured worth in weight. Helena arrived at the plantation when she was small enough that others could still call her girl without irony. She did not arrive in a single moment of shattering. She arrived in the successive removals that make up a life taken. First a winter of hunger when her mother was sold at a market, then the slow diminution of family into scattered names. She remembered a bowl handed to her by a woman with hands like river stones, remembered the smell of aguardente on the breath of a driver who had come to collect new labor. She remembered the way the señor's overseer read her like a ledger and assigned her to a life that would fit within the spaces they kept spare. Children learn quickly what saves them. Helena learned the economy of invisibility, to lower her gaze, to make her shoulders narrow, to move like a shadow. She learned which words were safe and which made a man's laugh break into a scolding. She learned the routes that took her around the house, so as not to be seen by the señora on slow afternoons. Learned to tuck her hunger behind work. Learned the particular silence that kept a beating from arriving. There were things she could not learn. Her mother's face remained a half-remembered map drawn on the inside of her skull. Her sister's laugh, the single brilliant note that used to rise above their small world, remained like a broken bell. They had been stolen from different markets, sold in different towns, and yet in each new yard, each new cookhouse, the ache of absence rearranged itself into a steady throb. When the infant she nursed was taken away, sold across a river she would never cross, some small hinge inside her swung shut. The hinge did not open again. The señor was a man who wore civility like a coat. He moved among his property with the calm of someone who believed in systems. His arms were not those of brute force alone. His sense of order mattered more to him than the proof of his violence. The señora, her hair pinned, her skirt starched, kept a house ruled by small humiliations, an order of place that made the servants understand their place. The children's laughter, bright and unhindered, had the careless entitlement of those who saw no cost to take. They tumbled through the hallways, their lives cushioned by a social certainty that some people were meant to never know want. Maria, the old cook, was one of the few who moved with an ease born of long survival. She had known other houses, other fields. Her hands were maps of years. She kept the keys, the spices, and if you watched closely, she also kept watch. She would sometimes glance at Helena with the flat look of someone who knows the rules, but knows too the ways rules are broken. The overseers barked orders like soldiers, and the capataz, a man who measured himself by the sound of his whip, carried an authority that needed only to be shown once to be accepted. A short historical note. By the 19th century, Brazil was the largest importer of enslaved Africans in the Americas. its plantation economy bound to sugar and coffee, to a legal order that sustained human bondage long after other nations had moved away. Slavery here was not a single monolithic thing. It was a complex web of labor, kinship, trade, and law. Its brutality was built into daily routines, into the distribution of food, the assignment of tasks, the public punishments meant to teach obedience. Helena's day began before dawn. The air had that damp, heavy quality of a place where the heat had already been promised. The fields cold, there were furrows to hoe, fires to tend, animals to water. Under the sun, labor became its own language, the rhythm of the back, the cadence in which a row was bent and straightened again. Whips were not always used because they must. Sometimes violence arrived as an economy of scarcity, the measure of food slices, the withholding of a shirt, the assignment of the worst sleeping place. Other times it came as spectacle, a man hauled before everybody with lashes across his back, his shirt open to expose the deep politics of flesh. Helena kept her head down as long as it was useful. She learned how to finish a task faster than the next person, to scrub a floor until the grains of dirt could be read like a ledger. She became quick with small favors, fixing a hem, mending a pot lid, carrying the señor's tobacco. Quick favors were currency. They bought you microtrances of safety. But safety was never guaranteed. People were sold as easily as tools were replaced. The law backed the señor. A formal document, a signature at the market. It was the way the house codified ownership. In the evenings, when bodies gathered in the slave quarters, stories traveled in low voices. Lessers told stories of ships and free cities, of rumors from the towns, of manumissions granted in dreams, of runaway quilombos that fed themselves on thick forests and stubborn hope. But these stories kept a distance. They were not strategies. They were small resistances of feeling. A song held longer, a hand clasped once more around the hem of a skirt, a name said softly at night, so that it did not disappear wholly. The accumulation of loss altered Helena. She was not born angry. Anger came as a result of catalogued injuries. Every humiliation, every child she had tucked in until it was taken, every time the señora spat a sarcasm that unstitched a piece of her dignity, made memory into a ledger of debts. Grief did something peculiar in her. It cooled into a resolve that was not hot and immediate but glacial and precise. You could see it in the way she watched the house's movements, the way her eyes lingered without seeming to linger at all. Routine is a teacher of truth. If you watch a house for long enough, you learn its rhythms. When the mistress rises, when the children are put to bed, which doors are left unlatched in afternoons of surplus and wine. Helena watched. She traced the route of the señor from his study to the veranda, noted that he kept his keys in a small leather pouch beside a green chair. She noticed the way the señora took certain doors, only when nervous guests were present. She learned the capataz's habit of leaving his club propped on a beam near the stables. These were not dramatic discoveries. They were the sort of knowledge that grows patient and invisible. The turning point did not come with an enormous, unmistakable flash. It arrived in a single brutal event that crystallized a lifetime of indignities into a palpable decision. The señora loved to administer lessons in public. One morning near the end of the harvest, the children were playing in a grove of mango and badocha trees that marked the property line. A fruit fell to the ground, bright and fragrant. The señora's youngest boy, bored and idle, was too slow to pick it up. A sister of Helena, small, nimble, with a habit of taking what the house overlooked, reached for the fruit and pocketed it. It was an act common enough in the quarters. People spoke of taking fruit as a means of survival. But in that moment, in that yard where the children's laughter was a backdrop to the señor's authority, the theft became a spectacle. The señora shrieked. The capataz was summoned. The child was brought before the family as if for a lesson. The whipping was public. Men and women watched under the shade of the mashim tree. The sound of lash against skin was a punctuation mark the farm used to remind everyone of the balance of power. Helena watched as the punishment unfolded. She had been doing a small task nearby, mending a basket, when the cry called her. She ran the last yards as if she were returning to a fire. She saw her sister bent over, hands tied, and the capataz's arm rising and falling. Efficient, practiced. The señor watched as an arbiter. The señora's face had the thinness of someone showing her social weight. The children stared. Around them, the world kept breathing, slow and untroubled. The girl did not rise afterward. She was carried a short distance, placed in the shade of a house tree. People murmured that she had fainted, that the blow had been harder than usual. She did not wake. The señora pressed a cool cloth to her forehead like a woman testing a delicate china. The señor sent for the local healer and for help. They wrapped the body, said the right names privately. They sent word to neighboring owners as if this were a small misfortune to be managed. Helena's grief did not explode in a single dramatic cry. It folded into her chest like a permanent ache. She stood in the crowd and felt the world narrow into a single hinge of fact. The system had broken her sister's body and then returned it to the margins as if nothing had happened. The household performed concern, then the household performed repair. The same hands that oversaw labor now oversaw death's handling. The spectacle concluded. Life resumed its rhythms. If there is a moment that turns sorrow into something else, it is often not lightning, but the slow crystallization you can watch like frost forming on glass. Anger hardened into resolve. The ledger of injuries demanded accounting. Afterward, when the mornings returned insisting on work, Helena found herself cataloging details with a different focus. She did not rage in immediate obscene acts. She collected knowledge. She noted the hours the household slept, the times the guard dozed, what songs the children sang that relaxed the adults, the particular spot where the señor kept his money and papers. She watched the roots and habits of everyone who belonged to the house, from the maid who dusted the brass to the stable boy who fed the horses at midday. She learned to move like a shadow, and also to think like one. She practiced the small acts of camouflage that had kept her alive, folding clothes in a way that left no trace, slipping in and out of rooms when the firelight distracted the host, carrying messages in the quiet time between night and the first clang of the bell. Each small success became a brick in a private architecture of possibility. The world that had taught her invisibility now provided the means to make that invisibility a tool. The neighbors were useful in that learning. Owners visited each other. The señora lent sugar, plates, recipes for preserving fruit. Men exchanged news across fences. In those visits, Helena watched different hands and ways, picking up patterns, how an owner trusted his house to certain slaves, how trust shifted in the presence of drink, how the hired militia came for festivals and left after the laughter dulled. The household's rituals, repeating like a machine, allowed someone patient enough to map their clefts. It is important to say what she did not become. Helena did not turn into a calculating vengeance machine overnight. She remained human in her ways, capable of tenderness, sometimes giving that kindness to other children, sometimes tending a sick woman's fever with clumsy, careful hands. She felt shame at her own thoughts sometimes. She would tuck them away like contraband. But what she learned most clearly was this. The house had the law, but the law could be observed, anticipated, and, if one had the nerve and a plan, undermined. There was a small incident that taught her how brittle the household's confidence could be. One night, during a festival the señor hosted for a cluster of neighboring proprietors, the guests lost themselves in wine. Laughter ran loud. Servants were everywhere at once to serve, to replace goblets, to hush a child. The señora, pleased at being the center of genteel gossip, paid less attention to the ordinary checks of the house. In the confusion, a servant's chest of small valuables was left open in the servants' quarter. Helena saw briefly that disorder under the varnished surface of the house made holes in its self-confidence. It was a reminder. Systems are only as strong as their attention. She began to practice small measures that had nothing to do with theft. She tested whether a door would not close if a peg was nudged. She listened to the hush in the pantry at certain hours to see whether footsteps echoed differently near the back. She noted that the back stair concealed shadows where a person could stand unnoticed. She memorized the timing of the militia patrol that passed only on Sundays. Step by step, her knowledge became a private dossier. To those around her, she remained the same. Quiet, efficient, unobtrusive. To herself, the landscape shifted. Memory had made her vow, but it was observation that would be the hand that tightened it. She learned the architecture of the house as one learns the pattern of a dangerous animal. Where it slept, where it was most vulnerable when distracted, how it moved when amused. There is a thought that haunts anyone looking at revenge as a plan: how to do harm without becoming the mirror of the harm you deplore. Helena did not resolve that question with moral certainty. She resolved only the practical: how to ensure the household would blame someone else, how to make the act both swift and indelible, how to construct a moment that would be a mirror, but also a message. In the quiet of her nights, she rehearsed possibilities like liturgies, testing each phrase until it fit the rhythm she wanted. Her watchfulness brought her to small discoveries that would matter later. The señor's study, for instance, had a loose hinge on the inner door, a hinge that sometimes caught when the house was humid. It was an ordinary flaw. The steward had been promising to fix it for months. The capataz tended to leave his hat by the stable door at night, and sometimes he would take a flask with him to the edge of the cane. The guard, an older man whose name was barely said, kept a silver whistle on a cord, and more often than not, threaded it into his waist to sleep. The maid who closed the shutters in the west wing always left one shutter slightly ajar to air the sleeping chamber. The children, when drunk with sugar and attention, moved between rooms with reckless ease. The secrets were ordinary, the openings were ordinary, and then there were the small advantages of her own position. People underestimated the women who served, the cook whose hands were always sticky with sugar, the laundry woman whose palms knew the lines of every fabric. Helena could be anywhere a servant could be. The back stairs, the chamber where the children played, the kitchen where no man thought to linger. She practiced moving through the house in invisible paths, a map in her mind made of hearthlight and faint smells. She kept these things to herself. It is worth underscoring this. Secrecy as survival. In the quarters, words had weight. Betrayal could empty out a life. The other enslaved people watched Helena with the same wary respect they watched others. Some moved away, some tried to coax her into gossip, but most were used to people keeping their own. Maria, the cook, whose eyes had seen many things, sometimes watched her with a shadow of pity that Helena could not read as sympathy or concern. They spoke in small numbers, their conversations held close to the chest like a knife. When the harvest ended and the house prepared for the year's big religious feast, Christmas, an occasion the señor used to gather neighbors and show his largesse, the house shifted into a different rhythm. There was more food, more wine, more elaborate dress. The señor liked to host. He liked people to see there was plenty. The plantation, for one night, would show itself in the luxuriant guise its owner preferred. It would be a small theater of power. For Helena, a festival was a field of opportunity. The house would be crowded. The adults would be distracted. People would move differently. Guests would take the rooms nearest the veranda because they liked the view. The children would be allowed to roam more freely. The servant rotation would thin as many were pressed into service to bring plates and refill glasses. The night would be loud. Sound would make cover. She began to plan with a patient, almost clerical rigor. Not with the fury of a theater of revenge, but with the steadiness of someone preparing a ledger. She made lists, not in ink, but in memory. She traced the exact order of shifts, the names and habits of those who would be on duty for the feast, the path the señor would take from his study to the place where he liked to sit and watch the guests. She tested in small ways the shutter on the west wing. She opened doors late at night just to feel their weight and the sound they made. Each small rehearsal was a promise to herself that she could make what she had sworn to do fit the world as it was. She was not alone in these acts of study. The house was full of people whose survival required observation, but she alone was arranging her observation around a single dark axis, not to escape, not to run, but to confront. The thought of confrontation had many faces. In her mind it was practical, almost dry. The timing, the roots, the spot where a lock could be loosened. At other moments, it was a repetition of memory, a sharpness, as if she were carving the exact number of lashes her sister had suffered onto the inside of her wrists. One night, as she sat by the hearth in the servants' quarters, listening to the low hum of people sleeping, she rehearsed a phrase she had not yet decided to say in any public moment. She shaped it like a coin, flipping it in her mouth. "They will remember," she whispered to the dark, not because she wanted the world to know, but because she needed there to be a sound that matched the weight in her chest. The words were a small litany, more a rehearsal than a full confession. They kept her steady. This was how the months passed. Apartments of suffering, the work of invisibility transmuted into meticulous preparation. Helena's life drew a new line, from loss to the gathering of knowledge, to a single purpose that required the patience she had honed in the field. She was learning that the only way to change certain imbalances was to strike at them where they thought they were safest, in the sanctuaries of their own complacency. There is a certain moral fog that rests over such decisions. She tested herself in the small hours. Would she become like them? Would she be consumed by the same desire to exert power? Each time she asked, the answer did not come in absolutes. It was complex and ragged and full of the contradictions of someone trying to reconcile sorrow with strategy. She would sometimes cradle a child's head that had wandered into her lap, and feel the memory of the sister with a pain that was immediate and raw. She would bathe the children's feet and wonder whether the touch was perverse when weighed against what she planned. She held the contradictions close, not wanting to explain them to others, afraid that explanation would be weakness. A neighbor's fate. One autumn gave her a crucial piece of knowledge. The neighboring donor, in his excess, had left a back gate unlatched while he visited a cousin. A servant had used that opening to fetch water, and in that brief lapse a man had passed through on a mule. Helena observed and filed the event, noting how a small negligence had allowed an outside world to touch the estate. Systems, she realized, depend on vigilance and become fragile when attention falters. The festival at her own house would be a repetition of such lapses, multiplied by wine and distraction. She had decided silently that the night of the feast would be the night to act. The thought of acting filled her with a cold clarity. She did not imagine a future in which she walked away unburdened. She imagined instead a focused moment, a surgical incision in the body of a household that had sewn shut her family. She practiced routes and timings like a craftsman practicing a trade. She adjusted when servants switched shifts. She watched the señor's drinking habits to know his precision of movement would be impaired by laughter and the looseness of conviviality. At the edge of her planning, a simpler question haunted her. What would she do afterward? Escape was unlikely. Outside, there were patrols and markets, and the long distance to freedom. If she remained, punishment was all but certain. But the point of her plan was never entirely about survival afterward. It was, bitterly and clearly, about making the household remember in a way the official ledger could not capture, the cost of taking. She wanted the señor to wake from a sleep of ease and find that the ledger had been rearranged. On an ordinary afternoon, while the sun was a hard coin overhead and the field smelled of dust and sweet cane, Helena noticed a small technical detail that would, in time, matter more than she expected. The west wing shutter, the one the maid left slightly ajar, had a splinter on its bottom hinge. When you pushed against it, the hinge stuck, and then released with a soft, muffled sound instead of the loud creak you would expect from an old wood. The sound, she realized, could be used to pass in and out without alerting those asleep in the rooms beyond. It was a small mechanical advantage in a plan that already relied on small mechanistic advantages. She tested it that evening. She waited until the household's laughter rose and then fell. She moved to the shutter with a small, steady breath and pressed her palm. The hinge fought her, and then gave. The soft sound she had counted on carried far less than she had imagined. It was, she thought, a perfect little thing. Ordinary, mechanical, and useful. She returned to the servants' quarters, with a sense that the map in her mind was filling in, that the disparate pieces of knowledge were aligning into a route. The plan was not yet complete. More calculations had to be made. The capataz sometimes fell asleep near the stables. The guard's whistle could alert quickly. The cook, Maria, moved between kitchens and quarter with unpredictable timing. Helena listed these possibilities and rehearsed contingencies in the dark. When she folded herself into the thin mattress that night, she did not feel triumphant. Triumph came later, if at all. Instead, she felt like someone who had opened a book whose pages were full of danger and necessity. The book's future chapters were unmade, but the first sentence had been written. What she did not know was how many other eyes were watching. In a world where everyone measures risk, secret knowledge is never entirely secret. The plantation's web extended beyond the fields. There were ears in unlikely places. An errand boy who liked to boast, a neighbor who disliked the senora, a child who noticed a shadow and told it like a story. It would be easy for a plan to be detected, and most plans are undone by chance more than by design. Helena felt the imminence of what she intended like a low hum. She kept the hum close, and, as winter approached and the harvest dwindled, she continued to gather small facts. The place where the senora left her watch, the days when the senor's ledger was kept in the study, the time of nightly extinguishing of lamps. Each detail tightened the cord of what she intended to do. There is a particular loneliness to a person making the choice to strike. The loneliness is not simply isolation. It is the solitude of bearing opportunity and consequence alone. She did not tell her plan to friends. She did not seek counsel. She stored it in the narrow chest of her mind, invisible like the small silver coin she kept under her pillow, a token of the life that had been lost and the balance she intended to shift. On the morning that would begin a chain of events she had only begun to imagine, she woke with the heavy clarity of someone who has rehearsed too much and now awaits the act. The house moved in its accustomed slow circles, unaware, as it always had been. The sun rose on routine. But in one small corner of the plantation, beneath the familiar rhythms, something had changed. An invisible line had been crossed from thought to plan. She walked to the west wing shutter and laid her palm against the splintered wood. The hinge did not speak. She breathed in the usual dust and lime and kept her face averted. Behind her, in the servants' quarters, someone sang a prayer without thinking. The household moved together in its graceless pattern. Outside, the canes swayed, and the distant river reflected light like a strip of silver. Helena closed her hand into a fist, not in fury, but in measure. The plan was not yet begun, but a commitment, once made, is like a mark. It reshapes the days that follow. She would build the act from the parts she had learned to see: routine, weakness, distraction. And so, in the hush before the house prepared its laughter for the feast, she put the memory of her sister into a pocket of silence, and she turned her gaze outward to the house that held the people who had taken so much. The days left before the festival were now part of a new labor, not the work of the fields, but work of the mind, the hands, and the invisible measures of time. If this story moves you, please take a moment now to subscribe so you can follow the full deep dive into its truth, context, and the questions it leaves behind. The house filled for the festival with the same slow choreography it always used. Dishes stacked on a sideboard, guests exchanging the small salutes that marked one man's place above another, children pressed into new shirts that smelled of starch and lime. Lanterns were trimmed and set on tables. The senor polished the brass of a candlestick as if polishing might make the world obey him more. Music began in the rooms nearest the veranda. A brittle set of tunes played on a borrowed fiddle that everyone applauded as if they had composed it themselves. The air held sweetness and the breath of roasted meat. The guests arrived in a procession of carriages that kicked up dust and announced power. Helena moved through the house like water between rocks. Her duties were many that night: bringing plates, tending embers, smoothing a napkin that had become askew. Her hands were steady. Her face was small in the candlelight, a place that did not invite remark. She kept to the twists and underpasses of service corridors, to the kitchen door that opened when a new platter was needed, to the stair that led to the west wing where the children were likely to tumble eventually. Sated and careless, noise, she had learned, could be a blanket. It let small movements pass unnoticed. Voices rose and fell. The senor laughed with a bark that filled the hall. The guests drank and spoke of land and cattle and the latest hirelings. Neighbors compared harvests. The senora floated among them, pleased to be consulted about recipes and the cut of a new collar. The capataz spoke less that night. He ate more and watched for a chance to boast. The militiaman idly stroked his horse's flank, his uniform smelling faintly of leather and tobacco. The guard dozed in a corner near the kitchen, the whistle at his waist catching moonlight every time he shifted. Helena's plan did not depend on chaos alone. It depended on an economy of small mistakes. She timed her movements to when a group of women would carry platters to the veranda, to when the senor would move to the study for a private cigar, to when a child's curiosity would draw him to the pantry. She waited until a moment when the household's attention divided into enough pieces that a person could move like a thought, unregistered. A factual aside, the large fetes and gatherings of plantation owners in 19th century Brazil were social theaters as much as they were entertainment, occasions to display wealth, reinforce alliances, and demonstrate the robustness of a household's control. Such gatherings also created predictable moments of disorder, when routines loosened and vigilance faltered. She had prepared tools that were ordinary and unspectacular, a length of rope that could be tucked beneath a shawl, a small iron implement she could use if a lock needed turning, the memory of a path through the dark where a loose stone had stopped making noise months before. She tied a handkerchief about her head to keep her hair from catching indoors. She tasted the salt of her own mouth and let it steady her. The children were the first to tire of propriety. They were given liberty that night, allowed to dart between rooms because feasting adults liked to see free, lively youngsters. They unbuttoned collars and smeared jam on sleeves. Their laughter came unpoliced, bright as if the world owed them that innocence. Helena watched them pass, their small bodies careless and unobservant of the ledger of debts the house kept in its back rooms. She moved after the second course, at the moment when the attention of many had shifted to a parlor story and a guest's rumor. She slipped behind the west shutter. The hinge gave the soft, muffled sound she had tested. The hall beyond smelled of beeswax and the sweet oil the senor used on his silver. Lanterns cast a tremulous light that did less to illuminate than to distort. Helena's shadow was a single grey smear along the floor. Her pace was precise. She walked as one who keeps time with another's sleep, a measured step for each breathing body she passed. She leaned into the places where feet did not want to tread, under beds, behind curtains, between wardrobes, where a person could stand and become non-existent to those who presumed they ruled the space. What happened inside the rooms is not what makes the moment unforgettable. It is the quality of Helena's stillness. She moved like a hand closing. There was no triumph in her face, no exultant shout. She moved with the economy of someone settling an account that had been overdue for years. Her hands were not eager. They were trained by a life that had learned to do what needed doing and then hide. The method she chose was simple and grim. It relied on timing and a silence that swallowed other sounds. She did not seek spectacle. She sought accuracy. The act, when it arrived, was over too quickly for noise to gather, and too suddenly for the household to make sense of it. The children woke, confused, then stunned. There were no screams that could be cleanly reported. There was the quick interval where a world slips and cannot be put back together. In the aftermath of that instant, stillness again became a coat. The house had been taught a new shape in seconds. Helena moved with a practiced calm to return places to appearance, pulling back a curtain, tucking a sheet, adjusting the bed where someone had shifted. She wrapped herself in the ordinary tasks of a servant, so that the house would register nothing amiss until the discovery. There is a moral weight to these lines that cannot be satisfied by the mechanics of a plan. What she did was not an abstract answer to pain. It was a response born from a life that had been systematically leached. The details of the act avoid melodrama by necessity. The point here is not to dwell on the act itself, but to understand what led to it and what it revealed afterwards. The killings were precise, patient, and carried the cold seal of someone who had decided to make their mark where the ledger could not be altered by the law. When the first body was found, it was by accident. A maid opened a door that should have been closed, thinking to adjust a curtain that hung crookedly. The second came to a similar end. An adult sent to fetch a child discovered a hush where a play should have been. Then the house's small rituals, calling, checking, the slow movement from room to room, began to collide, and rumor congealed into fact. Maria found one of them last, and in her finding there was a type of grief that moved differently from Helena's, older, steadier, furious only in how it cut through the day. Maria had been in the kitchen, tending a stew, when she noticed one of the small tables left untouched. She crossed the room and saw what the rest of the house would see in the following hours: a child that would not move again. She covered her mouth with a flour-dusted hand and stepped back as if the sight itself might break the household's unwritten law. The discovery turned the house into a theater of shocked, inefficient motion. The senor moved from room to room with a hand pressed to his brow, the mask of ruling composure failing in microscopic ways, a clench of fingers, a forced breath. The senora shrieked, and then began a long, reedy moan that was more performance than pain, an act designed for her social circle as much as a reaction to the personal. Guests were called together, whispers spread like oil. The capataz barked orders, more to reassert control than to find answers. The militia were summoned, their uniforms slotted into the stillness like the return of a false calm. No one at first suspected Helena. She had been present. She had carried this tray, smoothed that sheet, answered a polite demand with the low, practiced voice of service. Her hands smelled faintly of jam and grease. She moved with the others, her face composed. It was a measure of her success that she looked like everyone else, a hand that could be ordered and a shadow that would fit the shape of obedience. But nothing remained secret forever. The first hint at complicity came from a child, the sort of accident Helena had feared most. A stable boy, half asleep and restless, had seen a shadow where a shadow should not have been, the slight gap in a shutter pushed from within just a fraction. He told a neighbor, who told another, and the rumor grew into suspicion like a fungus fed by the scraps of truth. The militia questioned the servants with the blunt instrument of fear. They wanted a confession, quick and absolute. They wanted disorder solved by the law's blunt hand. People were rounded up in the yard, forced to stand while the house performed the rituals authority required. The capataz struck a man accused of knowing something he did not, and did not. The lash of his voice served to remind everyone of their place. The senor's neighbors assembled, not to help but to witness, to signal solidarity against the possibility of contagion, the idea that someone within their ranks could be dangerous. The law was being used as spectacle, a way to fix the fracture by naming someone as other. When they looked at Helena with the thin, rehearsed suspicion of a man who believes he can read guilt, she felt something in her chest tighten as if she were being bound. She allowed them to touch her, to prod, to frisk for tools she had hidden. She felt the roughness of the guard's fingers as an insult, and she did not flinch. In the galpon, under the low roof, where interrogations often happened because the house liked to keep its uglier acts visible, yet contained, they pressed her with questions. They wanted motive. They wanted a name. They wanted to see how the world would answer the lack of control they now faced. People spoke over each other, voices rising with the raw need to reimpose order. The militiaman stamped his foot like a child tantruming for certainty. The capataz crafted accusations as if accusation itself was a form of reparation. The senora asked for answers with a voice layered in faux pois and thin terror. Helena listened. She had practiced silence enough that the house thought it had taught her to keep secrets. But here, in the pressed heat of accusation, she chose to speak. Her confession was not a plea. It was not even an attempt to explain her act in the terms those who judged would accept. It was, as she had meant it to be, an indictment. Her voice was low and even. When she spoke, people leaned because they thought they were meant to hear the small voice of a servant confess. What they heard instead was the quiet logic of a person cataloguing injury. "I have kept a ledger in my chest as you keep your wills," she said. "Each absence you made, my mother sold, my child carried away, my sister broken before your doors, went into it. I am not the only hand that wrote in that book. I only learned to sign mine in your name. If you must know, I did it because the law you own would never right our hurts. I did it to be counted in what you do not count." Her confession avoided theatrical rage. It used instead the small, inexorable facts of life under bondage. She recited names like entries. A mother sold at a market in a town she could not remember the name of. A child sold across a river she never saw again. Hands that found the thin places no law would touch. Helena spoke of whips that left marks and of meals withheld, as if she were listing balances to be settled. Her words were a map of hurt. The galpon was a theater. The seigneur fathered outrage as if outrage were his currency. He called her a monster, a name that was meant to absolve the system that had shaped her. He said the word as if it would reseal the world as before. Neighbors nodded, the capataz spit. But their words were thin, brittle things that did not have purchase on what Helena had said. Her confession was not meant to be legal. It was moral. It was, in its way, a public proof that the ledger of the house had holes big enough to swallow life. She did not speak at length. Her words were precise and compact, designed to make a moment out of a life. When she finished, there was a type of quiet that is different from the silence of sleep, an organized hush that collects itself when people do not know what to do with truth. In the hours after the confession, the machinery of justice on the plantation unfolded with the speed of ritual. Men from nearby towns came bearing the language of law. A judge of peace, accustomed to settling minor grievances between neighbors, arrived with a clerical air that was both comically small and dangerously earnest. He read laws aloud that were intended to reassure owners and demonstrate that the system would respond. He sat at a table with neighbors and wrote with a practiced hand. The seigneur leaned in as if the judge's pen could stitch time back together. A brief historical note. By the mid-19th century, local authorities on plantations often conducted impromptu hearings and sent reports to provincial courts. The law was used as both instrument and display, with different officials moving through private households to perform the rituals of adjudication and punishment. The trial, when it happened, was less a search for truth than a performance that reinforced hierarchy. It was public in the sense that neighbors and militia gathered to watch how the law would fix a wound. Witnesses were called, though witnesses among the enslaved people were often unreliable in the eyes of the court because of their status. Their testimony could be ignored or twisted. The seigneur brought forth evidence, an argument not that Helena was uniquely monstrous, but that without punishment, the house itself might be endangered. The judge wrote down the facts as if the pen had power to make the world whole again. Helena sat with that strange composure she had kept all along. Her eyes did not dart. She did not plead. When asked to speak before the sentence was read, she repeated what she had said in the galpon, only more compact. The ledger of losses, the lack of law for their pains, a life forced to account in a manner not permitted by the courts. Her voice carried because people listened to conflict when it was presented like a commodity. The sentence was not surprising. Plantation justice favored spectacle. It is important to note that such judgments were not simply about crime and punishment in a private sense. They were a demonstration to others, a way to say, this is what happens when the order is threatened. The community needed the show. The law, in this moment, served as a tool to restore a shaken confidence among the owners. Helena was sentenced to death. The ruling was a certainty, dressed as deliberation. The neighbors agreed, some with relief, some with an uneasy sag in their faces that had more to do with the mirror she had held up than any real conviction. The militia practiced its movements. The town watched as if watching a play meant to teach a moral lesson about what could happen if order broke. The execution was arranged to be public. It would be a spectacle meant to teach both terror and complacency. People traveled from neighboring farms to see that the world still made sense, that a person who transgressed would be returned to their place through the most final of measures. The Señor wanted the world to see the reassertion of his authority. He wanted the sheet of fear to be laid clearly over the land. On the day set for the execution, the air was heavy and bright. Crowds gathered on the plantation road in the yard, near the stables. The Señor stood at the front of his house, crisp and starched, a man made for being looked at. His neighbors flanked him like props. The militia, in some misplaced sense of statehood, marched with a precision that suggested this was a ceremony of civilization. Helena walked to the place of execution with a dignity that surprised even those who had hated her. She had been given time to, in a sense, compose herself. She moved as someone who had always known how to contain grief. She said nothing that could be recorded as repentance. She held herself as if the body were a thing that belonged to the past. Her face was not hardened by triumph but touched by a long interior coldness. It is important to consider the scene not for lurid detail, but for the social function it performed. Executions in public were less about retribution and more about the reaffirmation of hierarchy. The spectacle was a lesson. Children watched, adults nodded. The Señor's face, finally showing a flinch that was not social but human, closed when the moment arrived, as if closing a book he had not been able to read. Afterward, the plantation returned to its rhythms. Order reasserted itself with small, almost comic efficiency. The Señor adjusted his collar, the Señora resumed superficial duties of mourning, the capataz returned to threatening small corrections. But something had shifted in ways the owners could not easily name. There was a seed of fear planted where complacency had once grown. There were small changes, doors bolted in different ways, more watchmen hired, a new flurry of petty punishments to remind enslaved people of their place. The reaction of the plantation elite was a mixture of brutality and anxiety, increase in surveillance, sharper punishments, more insistence on visible displays of control. If repression can sometimes be an admission, then in their overcompensation the owners revealed where their confidence had thinned. For the enslaved people, Helena's act and its aftermath worked differently. In the quarters, in secret, her name moved like a new kind of story. Some told it as warning, a tale of the cost of transgression. Others turned it into a parable of consequence, something that made the ledger of losses visible and particular. Songs incorporated the memory into lines that men hummed while working. Mothers told fragments to children in low voices like a cautionary tale about the cost of being counted. Legend grew around her, messy and contradictory. She became, to some, a figure of ruin. To others, an emblem of the dangerous possibility of retaliation. Memory is a strange thing. It compresses complexity into shorthand. The social consequences were not simple. Owners tightened rules, attempted to erase narratives that might inspire further action, and punished more quickly and publicly. Communities of enslaved people, dealing with their grief and fear, sometimes turned inward and increased their secrecy. The memory of Helena was both a wound and a source of a certain terrible affirmation, that injustice could push a person beyond the limits of endurance. Historians and abolitionists in later decades would sometimes point to acts like Helena's as part of a broader cultural atmosphere that made emancipation imaginable, not as direct causes but as instigations of moral imagination. It would be wrong to state causality boldly. The abolition of slavery in Brazil in 1888 emerged from a confluence of international pressures, economic shifts, political agitation, and countless resistances big and small. But stories of violent reprisal entered abolitionist discourse as powerful, if troubling, evidence that the system had internal contradictions that would not yield gracefully. The longer term of memory is mixed. In some quarters, the name of Helena became a cautionary whisper, a way to frighten children, or to make a moral point about order. In others, the tale was a seed. It was told in a tone that suggested a line of thought, that sometimes people struck back because law had refused them any redress. The ambiguity remained. Was she a murderer or a product of murder? Was she a monster or a mirror? Before we close, a short clarification about dramatization. The narrative you have heard is a fictionalized, composite account built to reflect the lived conditions, social mechanisms, and moral complexities of plantation life in Brazil. Where historical markers are cited, such as the legal status of slavery in Brazil until 1888, or the role of public punishment, those are factual. Specific events, conversations, and the inner life of Helena are dramatized to explore the tragic logic that can arise under systemic cruelty. In the end, the story's most stubborn question remains: what is justice in a world that has made certain bodies uncounted? Helena's act forced people who had never had to reckon with their ledger to look, however briefly, at the account they had kept. The law punished an individual. The moral indictment remained unaddressed. Memory, rumor, and song transformed the event into a complicated legacy that taught fear and, in some corners, became a grim inspiration. If you want to learn more about the historical context, sources, and nuanced scholarship on slavery in Brazil, please check the description below for further reading and resources. There you will find books, articles, and archives that distinguish between documented history and the fictionalized, interpretive elements of this narrative. A final thought, offered not as verdict, but as invitation. When systems deny personhood and refuse redress, people carry their accounts in ways that are sometimes violent and tragic. How do societies listen to such ledgers before they accumulate another body, another confession, another public theater of punishment? How do we remember those who were forced into choices by structures that made life cheap? These are the questions that linger when the dust has settled and the plantation's rhythms return. For production, avoid graphic reenactments of child deaths. Imply rather than show. Maintain restraint in staging violent scenes. Focus on reaction, stillness, and consequence. Use archival notes and brief factual captions to indicate where dramatization occurs versus historical fact. Prioritize the dignity of portrayed individuals and the emotional reality of witnesses over sensational detail. For further study, a suggested reading list and archival sources are provided in the video description to help differentiate dramatized scenes from verifiable historical records and to guide responsible engagement with the subject matter.